Hi, everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis, a breaking news reporter here at Forbes. Joining me now is Tinatin Japaridze, analyst with Eurasia Group. Tinatin, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much, Brittany. Great to be back.
Tinatin, I'm grateful for your expertise here because there was a historic moment on Friday in the Russia-Ukraine war. For the first time in over 3 years, officials from each side met in Istanbul. And before we talk about exactly what went on those negotiations, who was at the table, I think it's important to really talk about who wasn't at the table. Someone not at the table, Russian President Vladimir Putin. He did not show up in Turkey for the peace talks, despite being the leader who was the one who initially called for them. Then, subsequently, President Trump said, since Putin's not going, I'm not showing up either. So, to start off the conversation, what do you make of Putin and Trump not showing up for these negotiations?
Well, going into the meeting, knowing what we knew as we were going into the meeting with President Putin and President Trump not attending after Vladimir Putin essentially decided that he would not be there in Istanbul, the expectations for real diplomatic progress were already very, very low. And the makeup of the delegations made it very clear. Now, on the Russian side, we saw presidential aide and former Minister of Culture, Vladimir Medinsky, who oversaw the last round of talks that you referred to, Brittany, in Istanbul in the spring of 2022. And then Ukraine was represented by Defense Minister, not a deputy, but the actual Defense Minister, Rustem Umerov. So once the list of the Russian delegation was released, this mismatch in terms of balance immediately signaled that Moscow was going to be very limited in terms of its seriousness about this round of negotiations. So the positions on both sides were going to be rather lacking in balance. So the decision makers from the Ukrainian side were there, but the decision makers who could sign off on important matters on the Russian side were not.
To that point, there was reporting that the Russian delegation was made up of low level and junior officials. What message is that sending on Russia's side that they're not serious about these talks? I mean, why even have them in the first place if you're not sending your top guys to negotiate?
It is mostly symbolic, and it is a political move on Vladimir Putin's part. As you and I had discussed over the last few weeks, Russia was under pressure from President Trump to essentially do something or else. And the or else, no matter what Vladimir Putin may say on television, on live Russian TV, he does feel a little bit nervous because he does want to, on the one hand, have some sort of a normalization with the United States. And on the other hand, he wants to keep everyone guessing, while at the same time, we all know, of course, that he is not ready for actual peace negotiations. And it was very clear as soon as the list from the Russian side was made public that he is not interested and not ready to have an actual conversation about a durable ceasefire, let alone a peace settlement.
So let's talk about what we know so far from that conversation. As we talked about, this is the second one since the war started, the first one in over 3 years. It lasted under 2 hours. It was supposed to happen Thursday. It then happened Friday. What's the significance of this meeting? Because no ceasefire agreement was reached.
That's right. That's right. And going into this, I think those of us that have been analyzing Russia, Ukraine, not just in terms of the actual war, but in general, Russia's history and Ukraine's history in dealing with such issues, it was very clear that Ukraine went into this wanting an actual durable ceasefire, and Russia was far less interested in this. So the expectations were very, very low. We weren't really expecting anything major to get accomplished. It is, as I said, mostly symbolic. It's something, so I don't want to diminish the importance of an actual gathering after 3 years of the two sides not talking to each other. But as we were talking earlier, it's important for us to remember who was at the table on both sides. And therefore, that lack of balance and that mismatch makes any takeaways from this meeting less important, less significant, because there was no one there from the Russian side to actually sign off on anything major. So as you said, Brittany, the meeting did last just under 2 hours, and Russia essentially put forth proposals that were far removed from previously discussed frameworks. Most notably, they demanded that Ukraine withdraw its troops from Russian occupied territories inside Ukraine as a precondition for a ceasefire. Now, as a reminder, the Ukrainian regions that Russia has occupied since 2022, they're not fully occupied by Russia. They are only under partial Russian occupation. So they essentially are saying, give us those regions, the Ukrainian regions, let's call them Russian once and for all, and then we can talk about a ceasefire, which of course this is a non-starter for the Ukrainian side. So unsurprisingly, they dismiss these terms as unrealistic. So without prospects for a 30-day ceasefire, now Western backers, including the United States and the European Union, will feel increased pressure to have to somehow respond. And we can talk about that a little bit later about what those responses may look like.
To your point, Ukraine said that what Russia offered, what they brought to the table, were really just a series of non-starters. One Ukrainian source told Reuters that what they were saying was detached from reality. So if they're just light years away going to the table, I mean, how far away do you think a tangible solution to this war is?
Unfortunately, as per our prior conversations, it's highly unrealistic for us to imagine any sort of a solution anytime soon that ends the war, because we are talking about ending the war. Any sort of a ceasefire, even if there is an agreement on a 30-day ceasefire on paper, it is bound to break down because, of course, we're looking at a prior performance on the Russian side, and their track record does not speak very highly in terms of how they would abide by whatever is agreed upon on paper. So for a ceasefire to actually be agreed upon, that could still happen, perhaps now closer to the fall or going into the fall rather than earlier. But in regards to a political settlement, we are still a long time away from that war actually ending, which of course puts President Trump in a very uncomfortable situation because, as we all know, here in the United States especially, we were following his campaign very closely. And one of the big elements that he ran on was that promise that he would end the war very quickly. So he wants that quick victory. Now, the thing is, President Trump could still claim if a ceasefire is reached, and even if it is violated by either side, more than likely it's going to be from the Russian side, he could still claim that he did his part, he actually delivered on his promise, and he ended the war. And whoever is going to be the culprit there, he is going to essentially make them responsible for not doing their part. But as far as he'll be concerned, he will say, look, I delivered on what I promised. It is no longer my fault because now you have two actors that were supposed to abide by what was agreed upon in my presence.
I want to talk now about Zelensky and his relationship with President Trump, because after the meeting, he posted on X a picture of himself, Keir Starmer, French President Macron. He said he was talking to Trump on the phone, and he said that in the meeting, quote, our position, if the Russians reject a full and unconditional ceasefire and an end to killings, tough sanctions must follow. Pressure on Russia must be maintained until Russia is ready to end the war. What do you think of the West's position, and what do you think of that conversation where President Trump was included?
Well, it was important. It was very important. It showed something that has been lacking over the last few months, and that is Western unity, full Western unity vis-a-vis Ukraine and vis-a-vis the war more broadly. And it was very important for the European leaders to gather in the same room with President Zelensky and to reach out to President Trump, if nothing else, to urge him to not just maintain, but also increase pressure on President Putin. Now, whether or not President Trump will do this in any major way before a meeting can happen between him and Putin remains to be seen. And to your earlier question, Brittany, it really remains to be seen how much can actually be done in a bilateral context between Trump and Putin, because as we both know, there are two tracks that we are observing starting at the moment. There's the ceasefire-related conversations that the U.S. has been having with Russia, and then there's something that is more important, arguably, to President Trump and to President Putin as well, I would say, and that is normalization of economic and security relations between the two countries, between the United States and the Russian Federation. So there are moments when I do believe President Trump is more interested in normalizing the relations with Putin rather than necessarily putting too much pressure on him on Ukraine and on a possible ceasefire that can then in turn break the camel's back, because at some point President Putin may say, I am throwing the towel in, I am no longer interested. Now, I would sort of contradict myself right here and say that it is in President Putin's interest to normalize relations with the United States, because otherwise, no matter what anyone says about the global South and not the West, but certainly the rest that are siding with Putin on certain questions, perhaps not on Ukraine, it is in Putin's interest to have someone, especially a major player like the United States under Trump, on his side, even if it's not on everything, at least on certain issues unrelated to Ukraine, because otherwise Russia is going to continue to be isolated. And that has not been a very easy isolation for Russia, no matter what Putin says publicly. It has hurt, it is hurting, and sanctions do come into play. I do feel that at the moment we are likelier to see more sanctions from the EU side rather than from the US side, because at the moment, as you may have seen, the European Commission announced that there would be an 18th package in addition to the 17th package that was very, very recently released. So they are trying to do what they can. Now, this is mostly symbolic. It is important, but at the same time, it is mostly symbolic, because now we're talking about maintaining pressure on Russia rather than doing anything that has not been done thus far. I mean, there will be sanctions that were announced earlier today from the European Commission vis-a-vis, first and foremost, the EU Commission talked about energy sector, so Nord Stream 1 and 2, as well as the financial sector. There's talks about revisiting the oil price cap and talking about that and seeing what can be done to, again, increase pressure on Russia. Because at the end of the day, when we talk about the Russian energy, the Russian economy, and sanctions related to the Russian economy, we are essentially talking about the Russian economic machine that is feeding the Russian war machine in Ukraine. So there is a direct correlation. And I think that it is important. It may be symbolic mostly, but it is important, and where the US is unable to do very much because President Trump is reluctant to burn a very fragile bridge that he is simultaneously trying to build with Putin in terms of a bilateral format. The EU and the European leaders will have to do what they can to essentially fill those gaps that the United States, unfortunately, at the moment, is unable to fill, just given the reality that we are in with the new administration.
And I see just how advantageous it is for Russia and for Putin specifically to have that relationship, the way less frosty relationship with President Trump and the United States. But why is President Trump building this bridge? I mean, what does this do for the United States? Where are the advantages to America when it comes to a better, more cordial relationship with Russia?
It's actually a very dangerous potential solution, because I think President Trump is talking about this as a potential solution to the world's great problems. And I do have to disagree because I think that by trying to even consider rekindling relations with Vladimir Putin's Russia, we are, as a country, in terms of our national security, playing with fire. It's very difficult under Putin to talk about revisiting and resetting relations with Moscow because Russia is a very unreliable actor, and it's very difficult for us to talk about any sort of trust and rebuilding trust because we know exactly what happens when we talk about reset. We have seen this under President Obama. I do think that in hindsight, that may have been a big mistake that the United States made, and it would be very unfortunate if we ended up making that same mistake of trusting Russia when we know full well under Putin what sort of a Russia we are dealing with. Now, on the other hand, pragmatically speaking, there are some analysts who talk about having to rebuild some sort of a relationship with Russia, even if we're not talking about warming of ties per se, because this is the largest country that we could be dealing with. So how can we even afford to ignore Russia as a potential partner? There is a very big difference between ignoring Russia and negotiating with Russia. And the way that Washington has been negotiating with Russia vis-a-vis Ukraine, as well as normalization of potential normalization of ties with Moscow, my fear is that knowing what we know in terms of what has gone on over the last couple of months, it will be very easy for Vladimir Putin to essentially take advantage of this oil branch extended by the United States if that so comes to pass. But what makes me feel more optimistic is the fact that President Trump can be very impulsive, as we know. He does tend to change his mind. He does hold his grudge whenever he gets upset at someone. So this could very well be Putin tomorrow. It was Zelensky a couple of months ago in the Oval Office. So he can flip. In terms of his thinking, in terms of his strategy, in terms of his foreign policy broadly. So my optimism is that if and when, and I think it's really mostly a matter of time, so it's about when, we see that this very fragile bridge that President Trump may be trying to build with Putin does actually collapse. That could potentially make President Trump realize that Putin is not someone that he can trust, and that he has to put his eggs in the other basket. And that basket is, at least vis-a-vis the Eurasian part of the world, talking about Western unity and helping Ukraine, because our partner, a reliable partner when it comes to this war, is not Russia. It is about Ukraine. It's about keeping Europe safe and secure and rebuilding Ukraine, because at the end of the day, that partnership in the long term, I think, could be more beneficial to the United States, even if we're not talking about the sorts of numbers that we could be talking about vis-a-vis Russia, while the situation in Russia continues to be what it is at the moment, because Vladimir Putin will not be here forever. We are all here for a limited time. And when that day comes and there is a new leadership in Russia, then depending on who comes in, we can actually talk about an actual reset. Right now, we are talking about maintaining pressure on Putin, getting what the US needs in terms of the war and ending the war as much as they can. And at the same time, of course, we are not talking about necessarily aggravating Russia any further. So nobody is calling for a war between the US and Russia. We are just talking about being pragmatic and understanding that trusting Vladimir Putin and Putin's Russia is not in the interest of the United States and Western Europe.
And President Trump and Secretary of State Marco Rubio really put Trump in the center of this, essentially saying there will be no breakthrough until President Trump himself meets with Vladimir Putin one-on-one. And aside from the 1,000 prisoner swap on each side, there was nothing really that came out of this meeting on Friday. So what specifically are you looking out for between now and what President Trump describes as that breakthrough when he meets with Putin personally?
Well, Brittany, it could be a breakthrough in President Trump's relationship with President Putin. And now I'm just talking about individuals here and individual politicians. I don't anticipate any breakthrough, any major breakthrough that can actually hold in terms of relations between the United States and the Russian Federation, even if and when that meeting does happen. And I do believe that it will happen sooner or later. And I certainly don't anticipate any miracles in regards to ending the war. So I don't think that we're looking at a reality anytime soon in the foreseeable future where you and I will be sitting here talking about a meeting between Trump and Putin that ended and then the war ended in Ukraine. I don't think that that's going to happen. I wish that were not the case, but realistically, that cannot really be the case because at the end of the day, Vladimir Putin sees very little incentive to negotiate a ceasefire, let alone a political settlement, especially with a possible Russian offensive that is looming this summer that could happen in Ukraine. And he is insisting on Ukrainian concessions, including an end to military aid from the West as a prerequisite for a truce, which Kiev will not accept under any circumstances because Ukraine knows exactly who they're living with next door to. And they are not going to be able to trust Russia, even if there is a limited even if it's a durable ceasefire, but one that will end at some point, because that is not a peace settlement and they will still be living next to Russia. Geography will not change. So not having any military aid from the West is a kiss of death for Zelensky politically and a kiss of death for Ukraine as a sovereign nation. And meanwhile, we're going to see President Zelensky and European leaders that insist on a ceasefire first and then talks. And Putin wants the opposite. He wants continued talks, more talks after talks, and then maybe a ceasefire. So bridging these fundamental divides will be extremely difficult. And one of the signposts for myself is seeing whether over the next few weeks and perhaps even the next couple of months, there will be some progress on either of the sides that shows us that bridging the fundamental divides is going to be possible. Now, without trust, and there is still no trust between Putin and Zelensky, and more broadly, Russia as a country and Ukraine as a country. So therefore, for us to talk about any sort of a solution in the near future is going to be very, very difficult. And that signpost of rebuilding trust, I'm just not seeing anything at the moment. And if the meeting that we saw in Istanbul and the actual composition of the delegations and that disparity, that mismatch, that is very telling to me. And until we see another sort of a composition on the Russian side where we can talk about Vladimir Putin actually changing his mind, taking this very seriously, and intending to, if not end the war, to at least talk about tangible solutions and a tangible ceasefire in the foreseeable future, then I'm afraid that our signposts that you and I have been discussing over the last couple of months will remain the same. What I will be watching separately will be whether or not there are any negotiations in regards to the normalization that are referred to earlier between the United States and Russia. That will be interesting because that is in many ways an independent track where you only have two actors and it takes two to tango. There we may see some action, but of course all of that could disappear and go away if President Trump and President Putin fall out over Ukraine, which could very well happen.
Well, there are certainly a lot of variables up in the air. I always appreciate your analysis here. Thank you so much for the conversation. And as more develop out of this war and out of potential talks, I hope you come back on and break them down. Tinatin Japaridze, thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me.